Ibrahim didn't have the opportunity to investigate the stranger's arrival as he'd hoped to. The ferry that carried her had slid in the shallow bay that afternoon, and while he had intended on going down to the docks to ensure that she wasn't a troublemaker, he never got that chance. Instead, he found himself at the head of a half-dozen concerned calls as the town woke up to find their boundary broken, farms vandalized, crops trampled, and livestock decimated. Trouble had already found him, and that trouble seemed far more urgent than an unknown tourist arriving at the end of the rainy season. The rugged militia truck carried him and the other Miniteers of Pacer Patrol along that scrubby, rough terrain outside of town. Fallback Bay was a pretty sort of a place. He thought so, at least. Ibrahim would never admit to it, of course. He wasn't the sort of man who could easily mention soft, emotional things. He was the sort instead who would sit on the taverna patio with his wife to watch the white-sailed ships skirting between bobbing homestead boys, while little Antoine played kickball in the streets. A man who might linger a little longer beneath the amber glamour of the street lamps while the sky slid from purple to black, and the stars were scattered behind Suhail's departing footfalls. Fallback Bay Town had been renamed Ocean View a decade or so ago, but everyone who wasn't a tourist still called it that. It lay on the boundary of the old marked man's war, formed in the heat and pressure of those terrible times. Those wars were now thankfully gone, but they left their mark, and today it was a struggling little coastal town of 5,000 that was trying to remake itself. Tourism was the engine that drove the cities of the Sea of Akiba, but in the years that Ibrahim had been here, he witnessed his home struggle to keep up with the attractions of its more northward peers. The marina had more fishing boats than pleasure craft, and it was more often than not the locals who gathered under the pastel parasol umbrellas that ringed the beach. The fishing was good, at least. Ibrahim knew that quite well. The waters were muddier than the larger Green Bay, some 200 kilometers distant, though, and tourists liked their visits to Resolve's only sea to be a portrait of turquoise and sunlight. Ibrahim was quite happy to have the reed-knotted shallows of Fallback Bay to himself and the other locals, but he still felt bad for the struggling town he called home. They were trying, at least. Cheerful blue roofs and sandy walls sloped gently towards the broad ocean bay behind them as their trucks raced off, demarcated by the tall white flags of sails and banners that crowded the shore. The squat warehouses and water refineries along the port's edge only added to the charm. It was a real place, a place where people lived and worked, not another plastic resort like those smeared across the beaches to the north. Maybe that meant fewer tourists and their money, but that didn't bother him. They would come. In the meantime, most of the tourists came with fishing rods and tackle, and he got along with them just fine. They would come if it was safe. Ibrahim was set on ensuring that it would be, not really for tourists, but for his people, his family, his friends, and his home. The many wars that had scoured across Suhail's scarred history had touched this place time and time again, and had left behind a pall of anxiety that was hard to shake. He knew that quite well, too. He'd been an Ansari then, one of the organized militia that was doing its best to cut Resolve free from the unbridled evil of the Hadarites, then the Raffidain Empire. He'd fled with the rest of the Ansar along the coast, then a ragged flood of desperate, angry rebels with the Raffidaini howling behind them like erratic confluxes of a desert tornado. As they fled, they gathered allies and equipment while their enemy drew thin in the pursuit. He came with that wave and had yet to leave. Though it was peaceful now, the threat of violence seemed to always hang close at hand. Unlike those desperate times, though, these days it seemed that the only foe was Suhail itself. These worlds were not a cradle for humanity as Earth was. Instead, they were a school, and a strict one at that. No misstep would go unpunished here, be it by the yearly radiation storms that trapped worried homestead families in their cellars, or the punishing heat of the sun beating down on the lonely traveler crossing the inhospitable plains, or the anoxic winds that slew the unwary and brought prayers to the lips of the resolute, or the shard glass, or any other of a score of common threats. The worlds that orbited Suhail were no place for an infant species. Living here was a burden that could not be carried by abstract theories of politics or philosophy. Every Suhaili was born with that burden and felt it in their bones. As much as they may love their worlds, and they did, they could not flinch in their resolve to survive in an uncaring universe. God gave man dominion over the earth, mothers would tell their babes. But he did not give them dominion over Suhail. What rulership they claimed had to be hard fought, hard won, and forever defended. 10 minutes. Aisha's voice in his ear broke his reverie, pulling him back to the truck's cabin. 6 other Minotaurs held onto their harnesses of their seats behind him as the truck bounded across the rocks towards the periphery of the forest. Their driver, Aisha, made 7. He was 8. Abraham focused, and the implanted computer of his gut filled his vision with illusory readouts. Heartbeats, breathing, equipment readiness, topographical charts, situation reports. They all filtered along the boundaries of his perception, springing in and out of his focus with practiced ease as he examined each in detail before letting the information rest at the edge of his attention. Ready check, he thought, and one by one the team responded with their affirmation, their souls whispering together in a digital communion. Bahir was first, of course. Abraham thought of him as being little more than a kid playing soldier most of the time. He disliked that impulse of him. Bahir was in his mid-20s after all, but his bluster and ego made the comparison impossible to ignore. This flaw was something he was aware of, even proud of at times. Abraham knew that Bahir was properly prepared, though. He usually made good effort to back up that bluster. Jermel and Saif responded almost simultaneously, and he caught a smirk on Bahir's face as they did. Bahir had a competitive streak that often got him irritable glances from the 2 veteran Ghazi. Saif was a solid, taciturn man who'd seen more fighting in the war than anyone else there, and likely saw a half-dozen different men when he looked at Bahir, all of them now dead. Jermel, he was just touchy. Bahir liked to needle them, racing to complete tasks before them so he could claim some manner of superiority over the more talented Ansari. Saif put up with it. Jermel only barely. Mysara was last, also as he expected. She was newer than Bahir, and barely knew how to put on the armored pressure suit when they were getting ready that morning. There had been some chuckles and teasing at her expense, but she took it all with remarkable grace, quite capable of laughing at herself as she fumbled with the wide belt. Abraham knew she'd do well, if she could cut it as a Minotaur. He wasn't sure if she would. The other 2, Nasri and Fasia, did not respond with more than a quick nonverbal affirmation. They didn't have to. He shared a private comms line with 2 of them that had been active without interruption since the end of the war, their old company broadcast channel. Fasia's eyes missed nothing that her dry humor wouldn't pull to ribbons, and Nasri's collected and thoughtful demeanor had kept him together more than once. He and they had been through hell together. He didn't need to check in on them, and they knew it. Past the outer boundaries, Naramar Forest, dead ahead. Your favorite. 6 minutes to the Badlands border. And Aisha. She'd been through the marked man as well, though she'd been a logistics driver. Not that he or anyone thought any less of her for it. All that meant was that you didn't have armor or a gun to shoot back if the enemy caught you. He had no idea how she stayed so happy all the time. The running joke was that the Imperials had caught her and lobotomized the parts of her brain that didn't laugh. He wished more than a little that that was something real. Got it. Everyone knows why we're out here? Abraham considered running over the brief again, but thought better of it. Pacer Patrol took their role of Minotaurs of Fallback Bay very seriously. Whether putting out fires, putting up fence posts, or putting down petty desert warlord hopefuls, they were there to provide muscle and tactical experience for the town's protection. They knew the dangers and knew the tasks at hand, and a review for their sakes would be an insult. Only Mysara and Bahir were novices, and they were both reading as alert and confident. No need to shake them out of that. There were more than enough shepherds to guide them if anything went wrong. This job was the sort of thing that likely wouldn't go wrong either, but Ibrahim couldn't shake the doubt he was feeling. The Kanfasa were a yearly problem out here near Fallback Bay, but they were far worse than usual, and he didn't know why. They emerged at the end of the flare season, filling the scrublands with dog-sized, fire-breathing insects that were sorting out mating rights amongst themselves and causing a hazard for everyone else. The Resolvers knew well enough to stay out of the forest periphery at the time, and if they couldn't do that, to go well armed and with flame-resistant clothing. It was a nuisance, usually leading to more work for the firefighter volunteers than the hospital or the funeral home. This year, though, the Kanfasa were everywhere, not constrained to their normal boundaries. A clutch of them were spotted gamboling through the boundary trees at the landward edge of town a few days ago, loping for the greenhouses of the glass and steel agricultural tower before they were eventually frightened off by air horns and a few pops of a handcaster set to deterrence mode. High enough to teach them that they don't want to come back past the trees, low enough for them to survive and pass the lesson on to their offspring. The education didn't seem to stick, though. More came through the night, setting off house alarms in a dozen blazes as the dumb bugs were startled by cars, dogs, and the random surprises of the city. He and the others taught those ones far more permanent lessons. It turned out that the disturbances weren't a fluke. The Kanfasa had moved out into the periphery of the Naramar forest in much higher numbers, well outside of their normally reclusive nature. They fed on the polymers and crunchy tissues of the red-leaved electa trees, breaking down the sugars for nutrients and refining the polymers in their incendiary glands. It would be meager living out on the edge of the forest, suggesting that something had pushed them out during the flare season. The trees and other more flare-resistant animals could grow to frightening numbers during the intense radiation of that season, leading Ibrahim to believe that perhaps there was some population culling that needed to happen deeper in the gloom beneath the boughs. A squad of Minotaurs was likely overkill for the job, but no Suhail had ever thought poorly of oversolving a problem. What would be a chore for 3 would be light work, and safe work for 8. "We got a gawker, boss," Aisha interrupted his thoughts with an amused tone in his mind. "Looks like we got some bugs are wondering if we're edible." The truck gave an air horn blast, and he heard the crack of thunder outside as the roof-mounted spotlight cannon earned its keep. He blinked as he urged his gut to give him a view outside of the vehicle's cabin, filling his eyes with a ghostly vista of hillocks and twisted strands of younger trees and shrubs, eking out a living on the edge of the forest lowlands. Water was hard to come by here, with only the toughest bark and longest roots surviving. Further on, in the forest basin, the water table was close enough to let things grow lush and full year-round. A proper place for the fire beetles. Instead, they were here. He saw a clutch of them, maybe a dozen, watching the Minotaurs from a distance. The remains of a few more were splattered closer by, the intense heat of the photocannon's flickering ray cooking them to bursting. It was a horrible death, being killed by a photoarm on high, but there was no avoiding it. Life in Suhail's embrace was hard, and sometimes it called for hard choices. The other Kanfasa had seen, at least, and would know better than to approach them. For as long as the memory lingered in their dumb insect brains, at least. They were starting to descend into the periphery now. "Get us into the valley, Aisha. We'll ride in until we can't anymore." "Got it. 3 minutes to the forest edge." The Minotaur's truck slowed, crawling into a ravine that led them into the woods proper. They immediately began to bound and tilt as they did so, thick roots turning the relative sureness of Aeolian scrub floor into a gymnasium better suited for climbing than driving. Their transports were tall and wide, though, and well suited to this sort of work. It would be a while yet before they'd have to get out, and Ibrahim knew there was a clearing ahead that would be a good place to park. From there, they could determine what needed to be done and could get about doing it. Likely not a small task, a few days at minimum, but town wasn't far, and there were other Minotaurs that could be called in when the sun got low in the sky again. Speaking of that, "Fall back, this is Pacer Patrol. We just hit the forest. We'll keep you updated. Over." The invisible encoding of his gut's RF system made the code words and call signs of yesteryear obsolete, but Ibrahim still liked the touch of it in formal communication, for tradition if nothing else. "This is Fallback Central. Got it, Pacer. You have an additional parameter. There may be a missing civilian in your area." "A civilian? What lunatic would come out here in the middle of Kanfasa mating season?" Fallback immediately confirmed his suspicions. "It's the tourist that showed up on the ferry you'd been meaning to inspect for contraband. Was spotted out past the town boundary this morning." Ibrahim cursed under his breath as he acknowledged the unwelcome problem and ended the call. That new detail made this a much bigger problem. A search and rescue operation took dozens more bodies and much longer hours. But he wasn't spare on resources. As his lips pressed together and his team looked on curiously at their leader's change in demeanor, he dispatched a dozen orders back home. Volunteers were roused from sleep or called from work, summoned to the oncoming search effort. 2 of the other town's precious Al-Mushaba drones, war veterans in their own right, were prepped to launch to provide eyes and coordination for the search. A grid pattern was set, and teams allocated to them. It was likely that the idiot was going to turn up quickly, but it was a good idea to give everyone the practice for when an actual emergency arrived. The tourist was probably going to lead the search right to them. Just look for the person in the wilderness who set themselves alight poking a disturbed fire beetle. "No objective, everyone," he finally reported to his team, though they already knew. They were as aware of his orders as everyone else back in town was. "We've got an idiot on the loose. We're officially part of the search grid. I don't think they'll have been able to get this deep into the forest without kicking a canfasa or two on the way in, so just keep your eyes open for walking torches." They laughed, but they checked their first aid kits at the same time. The forest wasn't safe for a solo wanderer for any number of reasons, and though they might joke about it, they were there to help. Idiots should have a chance to learn, after all, and you can't learn if you're dead. Abraham checked his own kit as the trucks lumbered into the valley too. It didn't hurt to be careful. Pacer Patrol arrived at their stop and dismounted. From here they would proceed in and investigate the canfasa tracks. They were surprisingly subtle creatures, but Mysara studied them before joining the Minotaurs. She hoped that would translate into an ability to track them and notice problems, but Ibrahim was dubious. He could remember long days and nights wading through rustling brush as high as his chest in there, unable to see the ground where he placed his feet as he walked. Tripwires and spidery surveillance drones used that diminutive canopy as cover in those years. No doubt the canfasa could, too. The trucks would stay here, as would the spotlight, sadly. They could bring it, but it was just too heavy for practical use on the move. Their prey was clever and hunted in packs, and missing your shot could mean a napalm bath in close quarters. He and Nasri had witnessed exactly that while doing vermin patrol in Fallback Bay last night. He didn't know the man, but he apparently thought he could scare the big bull beetle away with a mop handle. He got what he wanted. Camera footage showed the beetle scuttling back and rearing up, spraying a jet of hot white incendiary goop and a stripe across the guy's legs before running away. He was being looked at by the town's clinic when Pacer had left in the morning. He'd survived with both legs, but it was close. The forest was going to be all close quarters this time of year, too. Flare season had ended only 2 weeks ago, and Resolve had been dealing with its aftermath, rain season. The waters that had been vaporized into the atmosphere by Suhail's torrential cosmic rays came down in sheeting rainstorms, and ferocious winds were only just abating now. The land still bore the scars and blessings of the water. Dry riverbeds had filled to surging overnight and were only now trickling to trickles. Where Wadi did not provide, the rains cut their own path, and cut them with vigor. Whole new ravines had been scoured down to sandstone in the flood, sending tons of sediment and surf into the blossoming, overgrown forest heart. Perhaps this was what had sent the fire beetles out from the forest. Rain season was fickle. Perhaps the appropriate nesting grounds had been ruined by the surge of mud and detritus, and they were only seeking out higher ground to lay their eggs? No, that didn't fit for Ibrahim. He didn't think of himself as much of a biologist, but he knew the canfasa would use the muds to make their nest, and they handled water just fine. The roots of the electro were massive and hardy, and were well suited to the yearly floods. They made ideal nests. This year wasn't so bad as to cause them to abandon their best nesting grounds. Something else was afoot. Their stop-off point was the same at least. Barren, muddy rock last year, barren, muddy rock the next. It was a decently wide clearing, ringed by gnarled roots and dappled red-green leaves on almost all sides. Water sat in pools in the rock's striated surface, while branches and rocks dripped in their tangled heaps, built up as a berm along the glade's edge where they had been left by the flood's coursing path. Everywhere was the sound of water, running in trickles and tapping out noisy drops on the wide red leaves above. Those drips and whispering rushes gathered into streams, then rivers, deeper within the woods. They'd settled into temporary ponds before sinking into the deep soil and sand, nearly 3 kilometers thick, to nurture the forest during the dry season before doing it all over again. Fallback Bay relied on the same water by way of an aquifer beneath the town. Fresh, filtered water, a treasure across Resolve and a special prize of the oceanfront towns. Fallback Bay might consider the forest a nuisance at times like these, but the two were connected, and there was a great protective love for those stubborn roots and ruddy canopies, though Ibrahim himself didn't feel it. God might not have given Suhail to mankind, but he had made humanity as stewards, the keepers of gardens. Who were they to complain to him if their gardens had a few rocks and weeds? If Ibrahim happened to be a reluctant gardener, well, that was his problem. No matter. Nasri and Mysara were getting the mule sorted while the others snooped about for the edge of the clearing. Better have a machine carrying their equipment, as they could be out for a few days on this task. The quadrupedal pack carrier was useful otherwise. The sensors it needed to walk and navigate were connected into the same communication network, giving them a wide-spectrum vision and a mobile relay to the local communication net. Theirs was named Raza, and it was practically part of the team. Ibrahim reached out with his thoughts, activating those multi-spectrum sensory bands on the mule as they finished strapping the tent in place and taking an initial X-ray ping. A ghostly image of the landscape stretched out to the horizon, overlaying his vision to show the rippling cut of the land that rain season left behind. New ravines gouged into a spongy mass of loam and litter almost as far as he could see. It was a swamp in there, and would be slow going. The shapes of the trees began to infill on the ghostly horizon while Raza resolved greater and greater detail, foggy banks of unclear forms pulling together into the hunched trunks of trees both near and far, overlaying in a grey mist of illusion that seemed appropriate for the oppressive gloom of the forest's heart. Just as he remembered it. Strange how memory shaped perception. He knew there would be fog, but it was sparse and light, melting away quickly with the approach of the sun. But he remembered this forest in mist and darkness. The Naramar shrank the world, so that nothing beyond your reach of your hand could be trusted. A yard might as well be a mile between those pillars of wood and shadow. He glared at the trees as if glaring at an implacable foe. The beat of drops on glassy leaves tapped their irregular, unknowable replies. That was not the only reply for long. Movement, and much closer than he suspected. A pair of bulky forms rampaged nearby, heading for the same clearing as they. The water's rushing, tapping music had been loud enough to obscure the sound. He cursed again. Squad left, Ibrahim thought, and the thought spread to the others instantly. They responded as a group, shifting to take cover behind the hard lines of the transports. Raza stood dumbly in the open, the machine unaware and mostly immune to the danger that they might be confronted with. A pair of arm casters and a hand caster raised up, the rest cradling their crook staves and preparing to move. Ibrahim knew they were just some dumb bugs, but he could nonetheless hear the droning song of a warrior in Hadaric trance in the trees, could see the yellowed mist of choke gas that heralded death's vengeful approach. The marked man's war had marked him, too. The first real sound of arrival broke his reverie, far more clumsy than the doomed Imperials that had once haunted this place. The Canfas in the lead crashed over the waist-high berm of flood wood that had piled up on the edge of the clearing, shrieking its high-pitched squeal as it clattered to the muddy rock below. The desperate thing's legs scrambled back to its feet, barely slowing in its momentum as it came charging for them, full of panic, clearly trying to escape. A pity it had chosen the exact wrong place to escape to. He didn't need to tell his team to take the creature down. Photo arms gave their retorts, the voluminous shout of their violence muffled by the dense foliage around them. The Canfas's carapace cracked as the laser pulses cut pinholes and boiled the meat inside, rupturing in a wet splatter that speckled the ground. It kept running through inertia alone, nerves still relaying panic beyond the beast's grave. It stumbled and slammed into the lead truck before finally collapsing in a hissing heap. Huh! Bahir's amused thoughts rippled through his mind through the patrol gut-slink. Undisciplined. Guess that one picked the wrong time. The driftwood berm exploded outwards in a shower of mud and bark as the second, pursuing Canfasa emerged. Ibrahim and the other experienced Minnetaurs were ready, unlike Bahir, but they weren't quite ready for the sheer aggression of the fire beetle's arrival. This one emerged in the air, amidst a tremendous leaping stride that brought it nearly halfway to the patrol before its hooked feet touched the ground. Longer, sleeker, taller, thinner, it was an athlete of a beast. It barely stopped, no more than a foot from the ground at a time, as if it had learned to fly from the El-Sakar above. 3 toes caught the edge of a ridge in the rocky ground and twisted, pivoting from its now dead prey towards a newer, more lively hunt, not missing so much of a beat of its 2 hearts. Ibrahim's eyes widened. Canfasa didn't do that. "Drop it," he ordered, with a thought, his own handcaster rising as the maddened beast bounded towards them. Thunder pealed again, chain lightning cracking across the thing's dappled carapace as a half-dozen lasers dug trenches through the thing. A hot red jet of gory steam gushed out of a crack in its bulbous back, but somehow the thing didn't stop. It snarled instead, mouth gaping and mandibles stretching wide as it launched itself like a rocket towards Mysara. She shrieked and fired wildly across its face, ducking left. The beast planted itself into the side of the truck, but still refused to die. It twisted again, shrieking like a boiling kettle as its ruined jaws clamped onto whatever it could grope for. Murder talons sickled up and down wildly as the beast wrestled and bit the truck's tire, peeling off ragged chunks of rubber and making the whole vehicle jostle and shake before 2 more bolts from the team finally ended its desperate thrashing. Perimeter, Ibrahim thought immediately as the threats were neutralized. Kanfasa hunted in packs and were as clever at hunting as any Minatiri he'd ever met, and he included himself in that calculation. The young and eager would leap in, leaving the older and wiser to circle and flank while the prey was distracted by the forward threat. They'd even feint and delay, employing tactics of such sophistication that they were a threat even to well-armed military units. He fought them off a score of times over his career, always quietly impressed by the creatures. They were cunning and they were proud beasts, and he hated to kill them. It seemed unfair, and an ignoble end for a creature with such fierce talents. But needs must. There were no other threats in Raz's eyes or the thoughts of his patrol. No, just a mystery. He approached the corpse of the hunter, hissing as it cooled from the boiling heat of the photo arms that had burst it. Burst it too many times, even. It was a mess of cracked shell and bloody split meat, stinking of ammonia and char. It had taken a half-dozen shots before going down, where most Kanfasa took just one. That leap, too, was far more powerful than he'd ever seen from the largest, most agile bull. It looked wrong. Hind legs too long, body too narrow, head too small, no spade-like tusks for tearing into bark. This one's mandibles were serrated and sharp, made for cracking and ripping. It clearly wasn't Formicidi Kanfasa at all. Some relative, an alien to this biome that had become invasive, maybe. He didn't know much about biology, so asked his gut to begin a search based on the image of the creature. The others were thinking much the same thing, even as they returned to packing up the mule and preparing to leave. Aisha was staying with the trucks, so was already beginning to pry the larger Formacid's body from her tire. He heard the voice in his head. "Never seen a bug like that before." "Maybe it's some other Formacid," he replied. "I hear they get pretty big further north." "Maybe it's some other Formacid," he replied. "I hear they get pretty big further north. Got pushed this way before flare season, maybe. It was a hot one up there last year." Nasri's voice cut in, laconic as always. "We're going to have the Kanfasa join the commune at this rate, just for the protection from the invaders." He could feel Aisha chuckle through the link, but it stopped after a moment. "Come look at this, Ghazi," she thought, and Ibrahim turned his head to look her way. The lanky woman hadn't been able to pull the Formacid from the tire. Its jaw was locked in a death grip that had bitten clear through the rubber until the wheel hub had stopped it. That wasn't what she was pointing at, though. The hook of her crook staff had hauled back its shattered body to reveal more of the wheel beneath where it had died. The truck was coated in its ichor, and it was bubbling. The corrosive gore was what was hissing and popping, not the cooling steam of the creature's internal organs. Thin ribbons of white smoke trailed upwards from the metal and rubber, pockmarks already starting to form deepening pits. Even the rippled rock beneath it was starting to steam as its fluids pooled beneath the ridges. The Formacid's flesh was liquefying as it died, and the remains were quickly becoming an acidic trap of its own. Aisha and Ibrahim shared a wide-eyed glance. "Jamel, Bahir, get this bug clear of the transport. Don't touch the blood. Don't use your crooks." Aisha scrambled back up into the driver's hatch as half of the patrol scavenged rods from the driftwood around them. By leverage and muscle, they pried the bug off, letting Aisha back away without dragging the corpse with it in an acidic smear. It lay there in a heap, hissing and steaming, leaving Ibrahim with a sense of growing concern. Fire beetles he knew, but acid beetles? With acid strong enough to eat into a transport truck?